Thank you. Thank you, Kim. We are very pleased to have Smokii, Sumac, and Sam McKegney, who agreed to launch what were supposed to be a series on masculinities. So, Smokii and Sam, we're really pleased to have you here. The topic today is Naked and Dreaming Forward: Reimagining Indigenous Masculinities True Story. Smokii Sumac is a pardon me if I butcher the names, Naka two-spirit and trans poet, PhD student, podcast host, and emerging playwright. Smokii's research for his Indigenous Studies PhD centers on the question, how do we come home as adoptees, as two-spirit people, and as Indigenous people more broadly? The Hasanaki podcast, which Smokii hosts, focuses on why Indigenous representations matter, featuring Indigenous guest musicians and writers, including G.R. Great and Tenor Campbell. Smokii is also proud to be a member of the Hakana Dikini project, where he supports conversations around gender and sexual diversity throughout the research process. As the team asks the question, what would a healthy community look like? Sam McKegney is a white settler scholar of Indigenous literatures. He has published 3 books: Carrying the Burden of Peace, Reimagining Indigenous Masculinities Through Story, Masculindians, Conversations about Indigenous Manhood, and Magic Weapons, Aboriginal Writers Remaking Community After a Residential School, and many articles on masculinity, environmental kingship, prison writing, and mythologies of hockey. He is a researcher with the Indigenous Hockey Research Network and head of the English department at Queen's University, Canada, which occupies lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Thank you, Smokii and Sumac. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hisukyukyet. Hi, my name is Smokii Sumac. Thank you for that introduction. I realize I put a lot of language in there, so I kind of forget it's in there. So thank you for working through. Hunini Tunaka, my elders say I'm Tunaka first, and so I just put in the chat there how to say it, and just to give you an idea of where I'm from. I'm just from above that little slice of Idaho that touches Canada there, so I'm just in the Rocky Mountains. And at the headwaters, my people are from the headwaters of the Columbia River, which then goes up and then all the way out into the ocean and around Portland, Oregon. So that's where I'm from, and I'm really grateful to be here today. And typically in our cultures, we introduce ourselves by our grandparents. So I will say my grandmothers were Sabina Tenise and Patsy Lewis, and they both went to St. Eugene Residential School, which is a type of boarding school that we went through. And my mother is Anna Sam Hudson, and she is part of what's called the 60 Scoop. And I am two-spirit and transgender, and so I use he or they pronouns, and I am here very excited to talk about masculinity. It's something that I have had to think about a lot in my own personal life, and also have been honored to work with Sam on this. Sam is an ally that has been part of our Indigenous literary community for many, many years. In our communities, we think of relations, and so I kind of think of him as an uncle or an older brother, and has worked with many of our elders in the field and done a lot of great work. And so to be invited in and have this conversation with him, I'm deeply honored. And then I just wanted to also honor I know there are students fighting and resisting against genocide, and I just wanted to honor that and bring that in and say my newest project is a book called Poems for Palestine. So I just wanted to honor that space. And then I'm really looking forward to talking about masculinities. I should say how you expect me to introduce myself is that I'm a PhD candidate at Trent University in Indigenous Studies. And I also am a poet, and I do some other work. So I will leave it there and pass it to Sam to introduce himself as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Smokii, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm excited to speak with you and for an invitation to speak with the African Studies Global Virtual Forum. This is pretty exciting for me. And thanks so much to Kate and to Phoebe for all of the organizational elements of this, and Professor McKegney for having us here. I'm grateful as well, Smokii, to you, and I wanted to start with a little anecdote. I was up in Paulituk, which is an Inuvialut community in the Northwest Territories, like way up in the north in Canada. I was doing some research there with some collaborators, and in that particular community, for many years they had lost drum knowledge, so the traditional Inuit handheld drum. And a youth from the community who was just an early teenager at the time had sought out that knowledge and learned to make the drum and to play the drum. And he brought that series of teachings back to the community. And there was a real resurgence of that traditional music. And they referred to him in the community, in the language, as the young elder. And I share that story because, Smokii, in working with you for all of these years, I do have years on you, but I always feel buoyed by your wisdom, and I learn so much from you. So I'm grateful to have this conversation. I'd like to acknowledge that presently I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Manitowoc, which is Treaty 1 territory, and it's the traditional lands of the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm here for the Indigenous Literary Studies Association Conference, which is going on presently. And I'm imagining that folks aren't particularly familiar with that association. But it's a group of Indigenous scholars and literary artists and students and settler allies dedicated to honoring the history and fostering the ongoing production and study of Indigenous literatures, primarily in lands claimed by Canada, but also North America more broadly. And a really neat thing about that association is year over year. So there's this big conference in Canada for all the humanities called Academic Congress. And so people kind of have to go to that once in a while as scholars. And in order to really respect the travel limitations that people have and the financial limitations, one year, ILSA is at Congress and tries to use the fact that folks are already there. And then every second year, the association has its gathering in an Indigenous community, bringing resources to that community and also creating opportunities for artists from that space, as well as community members to participate, et cetera. And the neat thing about this present conference is it's at the Forks in Winnipeg, which is an urban center, but a space of gathering of waters where Indigenous nations have been meeting for millennia. And this is, so it's sort of acknowledging and honoring the fact that Indigenous community spaces are not strictly reserved spaces, but are urban spaces as well. And the conference so far has been amazing. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm a white settler scholar and head of the English department at Queen's University, which is in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I grew up on the Saugeen Peninsula, which is Chippewa Anishinaabe territory. It's sort of just north of Toronto on Lake Huron, facing due west over the water. Boring place to grow up, but lovely place to visit once one has grown. But I didn't know that was Anishinaabe territory, nor did I know it was called the Saugeen Peninsula until I was in my 20s. I referred to it as the Bruce Peninsula, named after a Scottish immigrant and major figure in the colonization of that space. I'm of German-Irish descent. My father was an engineer at Ontario Hydro. My mother was a school teacher. One of my grandfathers was a chemist with Imperial Oil, and the other was first a miner and then worked in the auto industry. My great-grandfathers, of those who had immigrated to Canada, one was a farmer and the other an Anglican minister. Now, I share that background with you not because it is part of the traditional means of introduction in my own culture, but rather to illustrate that the social and economic capital that undergirded the privileged position from which I could first study and then come to teach and research Indigenous literatures, all of that economic capital comes from the colonial mission and the dispossession of Indigenous lands. You know, we have the fossil fuels industry, we have resource extraction, we have the flooding of Indigenous lands for Ontario hydro projects, we have the removal of Indigenous folks from lands for farming, we have the evangelical mission of the Christian churches, and we have assimilative education. So I say that because there is no neutral ground for me. I'm already deeply complicit in the colonial project. And I say that not as an expression of my own guilt per se, but rather that from recognition of that reality and that background come responsibilities. And as I mentioned, I have a position of some administrative leadership at a university that is called the Queen's University, which is in the Kingstown. And so decisions I make in that role and how I conduct my research and my teaching, I think need to be considered in relation to that history and what it pushes me toward moving forward. So Smokii and I chatted last night, and I think we would like to use our 40 minutes, of which there's probably only 38 or 34 left. First, I'd like to say a few things about projects I've worked on related to Indigenous masculinities, some of which engage with Smokii's work specifically. Then Smokii will share and reflect upon some of his creative work. Then we will ask a couple of questions to each other, and then we'll pass things over to Professor McKegney for that element of the Q&A before we open it up for conversation. And I note that I'll be using the term Indigenous specifically in relation to indigeneity to Turtle Island or North America, cognizant of indigeneity being persistent and significant in various parts of the world. So I'm going to start with something from the abstract from today's talk. Can a critical examination of Indigenous masculinities be an honor song? One that celebrates rather than pathologizes, one that holds people and institutions to account, but seeks after diversity and strength rather than evidence of harm. One that struggles to overturn patriarchy without making colonialism its focus. Can a critical examination of Indigenous masculinities be an embodied enterprise, be creative, be erotic, even be funny? Countering the perception that masculinity has been so contaminated by settler colonialism as to be irredeemable, today I want to talk a bit about some projects that examine Indigenous literary art to consider whether Indigenous masculinities might be valuable in efforts toward decolonization. My argument is pretty simple. If we understand masculinity as pertaining to qualities connected in some way with maleness, and we recognize that there are individuals within Indigenous families, communities, and nations who identify as male or with masculinity regardless of biology, then the concession that masculinity exists only in its dominant negative manifestations bears stark consequences. It means that the resources available to affirm those subjectivities will be limited, which is why, in the words of Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice, literature ought to give us alternatives. In my book, Carrying the Burden of Peace, I tried to illuminate ways of understanding masculinity that exceed settler colonial logics. Ultimately, I contend that masculinities can indeed be included among the resources called upon, in the words of Nishnawbeg author Leanne Simpson, to help ensure every Indigenous body knows respect in their bones. However, only if masculinities are liberated from biological determinism, anthropocentrism, and the dominant relationships among gender, race, and power that have come to be normalized in contemporary North American society. Which is why I'm so honored to be sharing this conversation with Smokii Sumac, whose 2018 poetry collection, You Are Enough, Love Poems for the End of the World, stopped me in my tracks, quite honestly. The collection is in many ways an honor song to trans male personhood and to personal, cultural, and familial reconnection, honoring the energy, effort, anguish, and triumph of becoming even while holding tenderly earlier incarnations of self. In a sense, the poetry is fiercely aspirational. What inspires me about the work, Smokii, is that you don't shy away from how gender has been impacted by the catastrophe of colonialism. Yet, you refuse to concede to the world colonialism has created. You write, for example, "Without trusting men, how do I become a man worthy of trust?" These lines betray a speaker in a process of becoming who is intimately aware of how masculinities have been contaminated by colonialism, yet remains committed to becoming a worthy man, and therefore defining him for himself what masculinity ought to be. It reminds me of, I was in conversation with the great Métis poet Gregory Schofield, and Gregory was raised by his mother and his auntie, and has referenced previously how few positive male role models he had in his life growing up. And so in speaking about coming to his own sense of masculinity, he refers to imagining into being the person he would have loved to have had as an uncle. So in sort of constructing his masculinity, he says, I aim to become the uncle to my nieces and nephews that I wish I had had. And I see that sort of aspirational quality is so integral to your work. So that masculinity is aspirational, even as it reaches back to knowledges settler colonialism has placed under erasure. It is imagined and imaginative, or as Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner might say, an act of being touched into being and enacted. Indigenous masculinities are more than what settler colonialism has taught us and told us. The simulations of masculinities, or of Indigenous masculinities, propagated in mainstream culture. So, for example, the stoic Indian, the bloodthirsty warrior, the noble savage, the drunken absentee, and the myopic masculinities disciplined through violent and eliminatory policies like residential schooling, the band council system, and the gender dimensions of the Indian Act, all of which, by the way, Smokii and I can speak to if people are interested in talking about those coercive interventions. These are not, nor have they ever been, the only masculinities available to us. These profound failures of imagination exist to quarantine and constrain our gender knowledges. Indigenous literary arts, like Smokii's poetics, offer more generative and world-building possibilities. They reach to and participate in a much larger memory that stretches all the way back. They interrogate the violence through which that memory, in many cases, has been rent from our knowing, and they generate new memories still, via stories armed to nurture a more just and balanced world. So with this as a bit of a lead-in, Smokii, I wonder if you might introduce us to some of your work and offer reflections upon it.
Thank you, Sam. I was trying to decide what poem to read, which is not easy when when I have quite a few poems. But the poem that Sam quoted from, I think there's a page in my book, and I did send a link in the chat there. I did put a link in the chat. My book is published through Kegonon's Press, which is an Indigenous press in Canada, and I'm not sure how accessible. I think you can order it from there to the States, but I'm not actually sure, so I apologize. Maybe check in with your booksellers or independent bookstores, because they can probably get it as well. But if you click that link, or I think maybe I'm not sure if it was on the poster, but there is the cover of the book. I was like, I don't actually have it. I don't have it right with me. I have a PDF here, but the cover of the book is, I sort of laughed because I submitted it, and then a little bit later I went, oh my gosh, I'm putting selfies, I'm putting pictures of myself on the cover. And I had a bit of a moment of like, am I being like Kim Kardashian here? Or what am I doing? But it's actually, since the book has come out, and in the years since, it is one of the things that when I share it, people are really struck by. And so the photo it's selfies as well as the lands, and so it's sort of a grid style. And part of that is because I wrote a lot on the internet. So my piece, part of that is the public nature of the work. But I wanted to read this. It's just one page. It's 3 poems. And the reason I talk about that is being trans. one of these, as we're talking about colonial understandings of masculinity or gender, I think it's really important to know, we've been mentioning about residential schools, and I know that in the US there was a boarding school system as well. And often I teach in my work, because we've had a truth and reconciliation process in Canada. And often I teach about what reconciliation means and about in Indian residential schools. And I ask people, well, what was the first thing that they did to our children when they brought them, when they forced them to these schools? So it was actually illegal for the children not to come. And if they didn't go, their parents could be arrested. And, you know, there's a lot of violence around this. So our children were forced in, and people will always say, well, they only spoke English. They weren't allowed to speak the language. They often say they'll cut their hair, which was true. They cut our hair. And there are just different things that they will share. But most of the time I will say, yeah, all of that is true. And most of the time I have to lead them and say, actually, the first thing that happened was the children were separated by gender, and by binary colonial gender. And so to just give you an explanation, our school, and this is a whole other story, so I won't go too into it, but in the 90s, our school had sat there. It was empty. It closed in 1971. So some of my aunties, we still have survivors that were there. And it sat on the land, and they call it, like, it was a dark shadow on the land. It was an abandoned building. The kids used to play there, but it was, you know, it was a really dark place where things had happened. And it was really triggering for people. And so there was a group of our elders and leaders that decided to change that space. And when we think about reconciliation, when we think about the ways in which we have to reclaim spaces or reclaim concepts, for me, reclaiming an understanding of masculinity and gender, we reclaimed that building, and it is now, the prophecy was, if it was here that our language and culture was removed, it should be here that it is restored. And so that was interpreted by our people as, we need economic development, because in the 90s in British Columbia, tourism was the biggest industry. And so it's called St. Eugene Resort. You can actually go and stay there. It's a hotel. There's a whole event center. We have our language summits there. We do all kinds of work there. And actually in the fall, we are having a celebration. It was supposed to be in 2021, but as we know, the world changed, but of 50 years of the closing of the school. And so we actually have all the survivors coming together to be in that space and to reclaim that space. And so I share that to say, in a lot of understandings, or the mainstream understanding of transgender, there are conversations about dead names, or there's a way of sort of erasing that history. And I want to honor that I don't feel that way for myself. And I also want to say, as I say that, please don't use me as a reason to try and prove to someone else that they should do this, because this is just my story, and every trans person can decide what they want, if they want to hear that old name or that old story. But the reason I share all this is, this one page of poems will show you it's moving. I was in the midst of gender transition, and you can see on the cover, I go sort of from femme to masculine. And one of my nieces says, oh yeah, this is Uncle Smokey's book, but he's not a lady. So because when she looks at the photos, she can see the difference. And so for myself, I consider this my whole journey of my life. So this page is about that, and there's 3 poems. The first poem makes me think of, I don't know if I hope some people are aware, there's been a whole conversation in the news or in Twitter or wherever, in those spaces, of if a woman would rather run into a bear or a man. So this is sort of when we're talking about masculinity. Many women say, oh, I'd rather run into a bear in the woods than run into a man when I'm alone. And I think that says something about how we think about masculinity. So our trained bodies know dangerous men, the way they won't listen, let up, distance, keep calm, but nobody will come, so you de-escalate and stall until a safe berth is reached wide enough and far with people around. And this next poem is after Katarina Vermette, who is an Indigenous writer, who has poetry and just beautiful books. And it kind of connects to, we have this is true of the US as well, but we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I don't know if I mentioned this in my introduction, but my grandmother, Patsy Lewis, she died at 37. And she was my biological grandmother. And so it wasn't until a few years ago that I learned that she was actually killed. And that the official story is not that. So this just mentions that it's talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and also just recognizing myself as growing up as an Indigenous woman. A past like hers, this 1,000 moments echo, incidents, strange men, familiar men. Be afraid even before you have memories, situations, these flashbacks, seeing blood on snow, handprint bruises, dark every cough season, a reminder she can't breathe. Bruises on her chest, visible to her, the blood still under new snow, and yet she's lucky. One of the lucky, not missing, not murdered, just a past like hers. And the final poem on this page is the poem that Sam mentioned earlier. If I can't trust men, and trust me, I've tried to find men who deserve trust. Without trusting men, how do I become a man worthy of trust? Thank you. So I wanted to share just that. As I sometimes make a joke, when I'm performing, I say, it took me a long time to come out as trans because I didn't want to be a man. And when I say that, I don't want to, alienate men, because I actually want to talk about how we need everybody in the circle. But I will say my experience of growing up as an Indigenous woman, as received as an Indigenous woman, as told and defined that way, I had many experiences. I often just tell my settler father that I had many experiences that when you read about what happens to Native women, things like that happen to me. And so in coming to terms with who I was, first of all, I didn't even know trans people existed. I didn't know two-spirit people existed. In my language, in Tunaka, we say tikkatsuk. So it's, at first we had to have a very big conversation about this, because in the dictionary it said pretending to be a man. And so we had to have a conversation about it. But my elders said, no, it's not pretending. It's like acting or doing the things that the men do. And so it was recognized that even in translating into the dictionary, the words we choose in English to define the Tunaka have changed the way we think about the word. But as we unpacked the word, our elders were like, no, actually, this doesn't mean pretending. And we don't we don't see that as you pretending. We see your heart. And so when we think about gender, I often tell stories about just the ways in which we are so indoctrinated into the gender binary. And when I think about masculinity, I was so afraid of masculinity. I was so I didn't have a model of masculinity that I wanted to emulate. And so a big part of my journey was meeting Indigenous men, and was then reading work. So one of the first Indigenous literature that I ever read, and I just want to honor, Sam told the journey of not knowing where he grew up, and like was in Anishinaabe territory. And for myself, I grew up where, my mom had moved us off the reserve. My grandma didn't want us to learn the language. She said, who would you talk to? You should go learn in university. Go learn English, go do well, right? And so there are all these pieces that I wasn't really connected to. And I always say, like, my uncles, my mom went to treatment and was in recovery from alcoholism at quite young. And so we stopped hanging out with the uncles. We stopped hanging out with some of the party family. And that's, the way that went. Of course, we're all, we've all reconnected, but it wasn't until I started meeting Indigenous men and seeing Richard Van Camp was one of the first authors I read. I started reading Indigenous literature, and Richard Van Camp has amazing work, and often talks about masculinity. I actually have, I will put a link to the podcast when I'm done here, but I got to interview him, and he has a line about like, I'm trying to be a good man. And so what does that look like? What does it mean to be trying to be? And he always talks about how we're always trying to be something. And so for myself, it was these models of masculinity that were different and were focused on gentleness. And just to give an idea of like a decolonized understanding of masculinity, here in Tunaka, our warriors, and I'm going to use an English word that can sometimes be ableist, but I'm going to share with you what it means in our world. So our warriors are Kupka Khatsin, which means crazy dog warriors. And so what I learned about that was that historically our dogs are really important in our culture. And they say that a dog in its nature doesn't want to get in a fight. And we know there are some dogs that, you know, have been traumatized or whatever, they're you know, more reactive. But in general, at their core, they don't want to fight. But if they have to fight, they will fight to the death. And so there's this understanding in our community. And another piece of this is that our warriors actually serve the food. And they have to serve the food to remind them, the part of the reason they serve the food in community is to remind them that that is who they are here for. They are here to serve community. And so they actually don't, historically in our culture, it was a higher honor to go to war and to knock somebody off their horse and steal their horse than it was to kill somebody. Because of course, a horse is useful and we're not trying to cause too much harm. And so recognizing the ways in which our narrative as Indigenous people got changed, and the ways in which we are seen, you know, gets shifted in the world. So yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. I'm not sure. I was like, I can just talk, and so I don't know about timing. So I'll leave it there. I've got lots to say, and we'll pass it back to Sam.
It's really striking, the run into a bear in the woods rather than a man. I recall speaking with Kateri, or no, sorry, it wasn't Kateri, it was Kim Anderson, who's a Cree Métis scholar of Indigenous feminisms as well as now Indigenous masculinities. And she mentioned that in teachings from her culture, she says that when the world is healthy, as a woman is walking down the street or in the forest, when she sees a man, she should feel safer. And how that's not the reality in which we find ourselves, and then how far we've kind of moved from those teachings. I'm noting that we're on a little bit farther than I thought we might be at this stage. So I just want to tell you a couple things about the project Masculindians, and then I want to pass it back to Smokii to talk about some of the health work going on in their community. But about almost 20 years ago, I was so as a settler scholar, I try to react to or respond to what I perceive to be cues to criticism emergent from the works themselves, and in reading a number of Indigenous novels from around that era, including one that Smokii just referenced, The Lesser Blessed by Richard Van Camp, I noticed a lot of similar situations in which a somewhat unsure of himself young male protagonist, without direct male role models within a family, was looking to a friend or surrogate sibling character who was much more legible within the sociocultural space as being masculine, and reaching to that person for a different way of being in the world, and it ending really badly for various reasons, right? And so, you know, seeing this in a number of works, I thought, okay, well, something's going on with masculinity, something's going on with the dearth of examples, and something's going on with what is recognizable as masculine in these social spaces. So I thought, okay, well, I think I need to turn to Indigenous masculinity theory for some of the tools to unpack what's going on. And in doing that work as a literary scholar, I recognized that there hadn't been a lot written on Indigenous masculinities in North American, in particular Canadian context, other than articles on white settler representations of Indigenous hypermasculinity, which we see all through, you know, popular cultural registers. But at the same time, there's a significant body of Indigenous feminist theory and a growing body of Indigenous queer and two-spirit theory. So, I was thinking, why is this the case? Well, given the ways in which patriarchy and heteropatriarchy have been imposed upon Indigenous communities in such violent and horrific ways with such damaging consequences, the focus on the masculine always risks re-entrenching that very hyper masculine and heteropatriarchal impulse that had been so historically and contemporarily damaging. So that body of scholarship was not there. So in consultation with some of my mentors, like the great Joanne Epistemologies and others, I figured that what I could do was curate some conversations with folks in which perhaps that kind of theory might gestate. And being connected in ways that I was with Indigenous authors, as well as theorists, as well as folks in community, I thought I could start having those conversations. So over about a 3-year period, I conducted 27 interviews, and those have been curated into the book Masculinities, and they're with variously identified folks. They're with elders and with youth, with scholars and with artists. And I learned so much from that process, and there was such a generosity of discussion, and that really triggered some additional work in the field. There were a number of works that came out by Kim Anderson and Rob Innes and others on the heels of that, building a real body of scholarship in that area. And so, having spent like 10 years thinking about and working with folks in those areas, I felt as though I could contribute some critical thought in relation to that. I recall residential school survivors saying, that my story is a gift. When I give you a gift, you don't throw it out, you do something with it. And so some work that went into a subsequent project called Carrying the Burden of Peace, I feel is sort of my a gesture toward honoring those stories that come across in Masculinities. And I can reflect more in the Q&A on what those interventions look like, but I wanted to share that as context for the work. And Smokii, maybe I'll pass it back to you and just ask you in this last little few moments if you could share about the health work that you're working on in Hunaka.
Yeah, that's great. And I also saw Professor McKegney's question here, and I can kind of tie them together happily. So there's a beautiful question and conversation happening here in the chat about two-spirit people. And so I just want to give a history of that term, because I think what you're asking is dead on. And I think that many of our young people are actually like, we're not sure that we like this term. And so I think it's changing even as we see that happening. But to give a little bit of a history, we know there was the gay civil rights movement in the US. And even prior to that, I would like to honor that the American Indian movement, as I know it, they talk about how they learned from Black Panthers. They learned from the Black Panther movement, and they were like, we just weren't doing some of this, and then we learned how to do some of this, and we brought it into the American Indian movement. And then we can also see those roots, like from Stonewall into the gay civil rights movement. And essentially what happened was Indigenous people were like, I don't feel like I necessarily fit in this movement. And we can look at all kinds of ways, it's kind of like trans people sometimes are like, I don't feel like I fit in this movement for gay marriage or these kind of things. And so Indigenous people at the time in 1990, they started a gathering of gay, at the time it was gay and lesbian Native people. And they had a gathering in Winnipeg, which just to connect, that's where Sam is today. And at that gathering, they talked about how, because on these lands, we have always had multiple genders, we've always had sexual and gender diversity, that it was different than fighting for rights in the way that they felt was part of the movement, and that we wanted to have something that recognized us that way. And so that word two-spirit came and it was this sort of decided upon and adopted at that gathering. And it comes from a word Nij Manitowoc. So in Anishinaabe, two-spirit, and it's just directly translated again into English. And I think that in this question, we can very much interpret it in a colonial way of that binary and two. And so I often teach, because if you Google it, the sort of the definition is, oh, somebody who has both male and female spirit. And I was like, I don't know what that means myself. And so like really questioning the ways in which we try and define and simplify and, you know, distill these. I always say it's like pouring the ocean into a paper cup to try and come up with one of these definitions. And so what I see now is we are having reclamation of our own words. And I wanted to honor this, thinking about the idea of multiple spirits and multiple ways of moving through. But the way that I really learned this, as I started asking questions about this identity, is that essentially it means that we can hold, I won't say any role, but I will say nearly any role. And when I speak about this, I have to be very careful, because in the colonial world, the definition has now become two-spirit people are special. Two-spirit people are medicine people. Two-spirit people live next to the leaders. And there's sort of this thing that happens in the youth where they're like, we're really special, which I think is good. However, when I came home, I'm working on our Hatskanat Ikineth team, which is many ways of working on the same thing. So there's a website there. And I got invited to work on gender and sexuality. And this was because the health research team had been doing work for a few years. And then we got a grant through the Canadian Health Research Granting Agency. And they said, you have to have a gender lens. And the interesting thing about Tanaka is we don't actually subscribe a lot to the gender binary and the roles, but I was invited in to support this. And I started talking to the elders about, what does two-spirit mean? And I was pretty new at coming home. So I know I've got elders, they're in their 70s. They can't really hear. I was very nervous. I was talking very quiet, and I was not making eye contact. And at some point you can hear one go, what's he talking about? And the other one goes, it means gay, like in that whisper where they're actually, it was quite funny. But at the time there was the late Herman Alpine, and he started sharing, and he said, I used to wonder if I was that way. And that's how they talk about it, that way. And he said, because of what happened to me in those schools. And so we recognized that there was an extreme amount of sexual violence and abuse in residential schools. And then he sort of said, oh, but then I heard a talk. I was in Vancouver and I heard a talk, and that same thing, lifting two-spirit people up, talking about us as, medicine people, all these things. And as he was talking about this, his cousin, our elder Dorothy, kind of went, ah. But we've worked very hard, so Herman gets to finish his piece. And at that moment, I go, okay, this is where it's going to come. I'm going to hear homophobia. I'm going to hear this thing. So finally, I turned to Dorothy and I'm like, did you have something to add? And she just went, yeah, it's not like that. You're not special. You're just Donaka. And I was like, oh. And it was for me, you hear that you're not special, but essentially what they're telling me is we're all part of the circle, and that men are not higher than women, and two-spirit people are not higher than men or women. And our elders, in fact, our elders often say, I don't know much, right? They'll just share this piece. And for a long time, I thought, oh, they don't know much. And then I started to learn that it was, oh no, this is the cultural humility of them saying, I'll share what I know, but I can always learn. And so when we're thinking about these words, what I see is our young people are starting to reclaim the words in our languages of what that means. And this is a very slow process because our languages were, colonized away out of us. And then we also have Catholicism just influencing everything. And so I think that we are approaching a new place with this. But I also just wanted to share a story where I helped an elder pass in 2018. And in those final moments, it was just his wife and myself. And he taught me a lot. He's Anishinaabe. He's Bodwe Wadumi. So their people they live in the Wisconsin area, but he was living up in Peterborough, Ontario. And we were sitting with him, and he had taught us a lot about what should happen when somebody passes. And so one of the things was, the cedar bath. There's a cedar bath after they go, and that should be done by grandmothers. And there was a very specific, they should be laughing and telling jokes about the person. And I thought that was really unique. But here we are. So here we are, and it's his wife and myself, and she is a grandmother, but this is who's here. And so in that moment, I stepped into that role, and we did how he taught me to do. And when I think of that, I can only tell it through story. I can only share through story about these moments. But what I always say is that it doesn't mean that I walked out of that room and said, well, I did the role of a grandmother, so I'm a grandmother now. Like, it doesn't work that way. But in that moment where there was no grandmother to do that role, or there was only one grandmother and there should be more than one, I stepped in and I was able to do that. There have been other moments where, for example, firekeeping can be a more of a masculine role. That is changing, luckily. But where if there's no person to do that, then I will step in and do that. If there's no person to sing a water song, I can step in and do that. But it's to recognize that we are here to support those spaces in between when there's not somebody. And the reality is we're all praying for there to be somebody there. I hope that our circle, those gaps in our circle, get filled to the point where we can actually look at what does our society as Two-Spirit people, or, you know, I'm using that English language, but as Tikatsik, what does that mean for my role? And how do we honor those spaces? So it's been really beautiful to do this work in my nation and to bring this back. And I just want to share, there is a Two-Spirit flag, which is the inclusive flag. So the rainbow and the triangle and the circle, and it also has two feathers on it. And we just, I'm going to a powwow this weekend. It's the first one of the season. And we've donated a flag, and we have a young trans Tunaka boy, he's a boy, he's young, who will be walking in the Two-Spirit flag with the Canadian flag and the American flag and the other colors that come in. And I just, so I share that today to say that we are changing the ways that our communities think about gender. And I hope that ripples outward. So thank you. And I'm like, it's the timing. I'm like, okay, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Smokii and Sam. This has been really, really eye-opening. We'll hand it over to Prof. McKegney, who will ask a few questions.
Thank you very much, Smokii and Sam. I would like to engage in a conversation with you, but it's predicated on the fact that I'm not completely familiar with the scholarship that you guys are talking about. So this is more or less like an outsider looking in and curious to know how these things are playing themselves out. Within the scholarship on Indigenous masculinities and in that area, what are the current debates? What are the issues that you guys are currently grappling with, both scholastically and in terms of experientially? If you were to identify those key areas in terms of the current agenda, what are the issues that you are currently seeking to address?
If I can start on that, Smokii, experientially in relation to the scholarship,
yes,
one of the most significant areas that's being discussed, debated, and really grappled with is the behaviors of some who are the sources of the theory itself. So there have been folks who've been working on expressing like both reclamations of specific cultural knowledges around masculinity and sharing those publicly in scholarship and other forms, who actually proven to act in ways that are counter to those very expressions of positive masculinities. So those breaches of trust have very much kind of harmed the ability for that knowledge to be shared in safe ways, and have made, when I mentioned the earlier skepticism about whether Indigenous masculinity studies can even be positive in a context where colonial heteropatriarchy and imposed hypermasculinity have been so problematic, then that anxiety about what masculinity studies can do, that has been further, I think, problematized through the behaviors of some folks who have been working in the field. So that's a major issue that has we have some discussions of in Carrying the Burden of Peace, and others have commented on. There was a point maybe 5 or 6 years ago where there were having the first sort of conferences on Indigenous masculinity specifically, and working on that theory. And at that time, there were significant figures in Indigenous studies circles who were saying, Indigenous masculinity studies should not occupy space that needs to be held by Indigenous feminist studies and Indigenous queer two-spirit theory. And so that this was actually counter to, rather than complementary to, those other fields of study. And I don't begrudge those who argue that. And I'm certainly willing to say that my contentions around how productive, fluid, backward and forward looking expressions of masculinity as an ethic, my contention that those can be mobilized in ways that are world building and positive, I'm aware that they may also be problematic at the same time, and they may also cause harm. So that's a major thing that's being discussed that I thought should be the first one to note. Smokii, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I just will say that I think that that's a thing that we're, in this era that has come out of, Me Too, and even this conversation about the bear, there's, with power and with colonial trauma and all of these things, we're seeing that there are, there's a question of what do we do with the abusers, and what do we do if somebody is an abuser that was in this field, right? And how do we kind of support the field? And I tend to be someone who, so coming from community, we have the same conversations, and my elders say there are not enough Tunaka to even lose one. And I have learned in the past, I always think of that as, I look at that as like young people and trying to survive and all of this, but it was also an understanding that came about when allegations of abuse were coming out, and how do we actually, what is the way that our community deals with this, and how do we actually support men, which then also creates the conversation of, well, are we doing enough to support women, and are we doing enough to support, these conversations? And so, yeah, when people say the field shouldn't exist, I tend to look at, with my students, a lot of them, they would say, well, I'm settler Canadian, but I don't like saying I'm settler Canadian. I don't like saying that I'm white, or I don't like, it's hard to say these things. And I would say, well, maybe you need to change what the definition of settler Canadian is. Maybe you need to work to, if that's who you are and you want it to be something good. And so that's how I look at in this field of saying, like, we have to talk about masculinity, because otherwise we're putting our men out there where they're not, the healing is not a part of the community. And as I said, we're at being all part of the circle. We need to be able to support that. And so I'm appreciative of the conversations and the people that are talking about this and bringing these conversations to light. And I also recognize that for a lot of survivors, this can be a triggering field. And so we, as we say, we honor wherever anyone is in the orbit of it, and recognizing that sometimes lifting up men or talking about masculinity can be really fraught. So thank you.
So am I correct then to say in the field of Indigenous masculinities, you have got a stage where you now blur the differences between who is saying something and what they are saying. Let me explain a little bit. That it's no longer a question of what are the intellectual or arguments that they are making, but whether their ethical behavior is consistent with the argument that they are making. So the scholarship is moved from focusing on what so-and-so says to saying, but who is that person who is saying that? Is that the direction you think this is going?
I think that's the direction the critique of the field is definitely going.
Okay.
But I also, just to answer that, we mentioned like how Sam and I got connected.
Yes.
If we think about, we are a larger population in Canada, so we are about 4 or 5% Indigenous people, are about 4 or 5% of the Canadian population, but that's still a small community. And so when we look at Indigenous literary studies, it's a very small community.
Yes.
And so I think I just want to bring in that context of, because we are a very small community, we know each other very well. We go to the same conferences, we connect. And so it's, in a way, there's not the anonymity. Like, as an example, as a professor, when I'm teaching Indigenous literary studies, if somebody tries to plagiarize, I know the 10 papers it came from, right? Or I know that, like, it's, in fact, I had a student try to plagiarize Sam's paper almost exactly. And I was like, well, that's my friend Sam's paper, because we're such a small community. And so knowing that, it's that because we have that connection, we call it like the anti-network, people warn each other about people. That's why our who we are is such a deep part of this conversation. And you'll recognize that when we introduced ourselves, we're introducing ourselves by our relationship. And so the transgressions of relationship within this small field, I think, stand out in that way, that the work, some people are saying that we should not even cite that work by that person. And in fact, I was asked to rewrite an intro for a scholar, because it was written by, the first intro to their book, and they were reprinting it, was written by somebody who had transgressed in the way that they didn't feel ethically connected to. And so they invited me in to write a new introduction. So that is happening in our field. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Okay. Then my last question, and then I'll hand over to Kim. Since you are a fairly small group, but small in size does not mean you don't have a major impact. All right. So the question that comes up for me is then the notion of allyship. Because you're a small group, I find it, for example, when I am in African studies, I have to establish allies, let's say in applied linguistics, in different areas. So what I'm really curious about is, how does the notion of allyship play itself out in Indigenous community, in your sort of area? Is this what some of the things that you discuss amongst yourselves, or what? Let me backtrack a bit. The conversation I'm interested to get insight into is a conversation that, let's say, the two of you may be having when you're just walking towards a presentation. You know, those fascinating academic conversations in which you say, but I don't think this is working, or that is working. That is those are the moments of epiphany that I'm trying to grapple with. What do they actually talk about, these guys, when they are on their own, without having anybody looking in as they express moments of uncertainty or moments of excitement. Yeah.
I can, do you want to go first? I'll go, okay. So it's like I think Sam will agree on this. We are definitely talking about allyship. That is a conversation that comes up about settler Canadian work. I think one of the things we talk about the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, so coming specifically from Indigenous literatures, and one of the difficulties that place has is that, you know, and I'm going to make a joke here, but some of us as Indigenous creatives and academics, we're like, we're not going to go unless you pay us to come. And so, and that's not normal for grad students. But the reality is, like, I'm here home in my community. I'm working very hard. We're hustling. We're doing the poetry and we're doing this work. And so what we see is that field is actually made up of mostly allies. And they're trying to change that. And I think also because we're a small community, there were some elders that worked very hard. There were some aunties that worked very hard to create that. And then we go through cycles of how the world changes. And for us as academics and creatives, like for me, it feels more exciting to do my creative work than to go do the academic paper. And so you have, you're going to these conferences where, yes, it's about Indigenous literature studies, but perhaps the majority of people are settler Canadian allies. So what happens in that conversation, or how welcome do the Indigenous people feel in that space? And also, you know, we have single mothers. How are they being supported by the gathering? And when we talk about those economic privileges, you know, I often say that as a Tunaka person, like this week, I couldn't go to this conference because I had too many responsibilities here in my home nation. And I don't know, you know, how often Sam has to stop everything to go to a funeral. I have to do that. We are still facing genocide, right? I have to do that far too often in my community. And so we look at these these big gaps in what is happening. And I think that's one of the major conversations we have. And I think I often am looking to Sam to say, you know, I hope that you're teaching these settler allies, because I don't use that word lightly. And when I talk about Sam, I just want to share one of if I get this story wrong, correct me, but I think it was Lee Miracle. Sam had said, well, I've done all these interviews and now I need to figure out what I'm going to do with them. And she said to him, you don't need to do anything, just print them. They don't want to hear from you. They want to hear from us. So, you know, I appreciate that sort of like lifting up of our voices. And even in this talk, you know, he reached out to me immediately and said, you know, I'd like you to be there because I want to lift up your voice rather than being the only voice in the room. And you'll see through his books, Sam is not the only voice in the room in his pieces. And in fact, he's lifting up our voices in ways that I think we have to do in those institutions, or I think settler Canadian allies have to do, and American the same. So I will leave it there.
Thanks so much for that, Smokii. The one thing I will note is that ally is not an identity. It's not a subject position. One aspires toward allyship, and allyship is an action. It's an active impulse that one mobilizes, and one must continually move back to it. But you know, I balk at when I hear colleagues self-identify as an ally, because you can't know whether you could have the best intentions in the world and be damaging in your efforts toward allyship. So I think that's an important thing. With relation to the building of the field of Indigenous literary studies in Canada, I mean, the field has really grown into being in the last 20 years. And so having worked throughout that time, I mean, what some of the initial work was just to convince institutions to have courses that focused upon Indigenous literatures, to get those knowledges and that creative expression in front of students as part of their necessary learning experience. And that required a lot of labor, of intellectual labor and otherwise. But the goal, for me, for example, has always been to work myself out of a job, because I should not be the one teaching those literatures in that classroom. But the critical mass of Indigenous literary scholars has tended to be quite small for, very understandable reasons. With communities with so much need to mobilize intellectual resources that they have in various ways, literary studies isn't always the route that youth are directed toward. So, balancing the need to ensure that those literatures are honored and taught, and those books from those authors are being purchased by students, which is actually economically very significant. That's one side of it. But the goal is always to build capacity with Indigenous scholars doing that work.
And if I can
Thank you very much. Thanks. Let me hand over to Kim, and because I think there will be other people on this call who want to ask a couple of questions. Kim.
Yeah, Smokii, if you want to finish your thought.
I just,
Mm.
yeah,
No
sorry, I
problem.
just wanted to jump in for a second, just to say the other piece about this is that for us, our homes as Indigenous people, many of them aren't places where we have a university. And so for me, moving home meant that I like, to be a professor, to work in the field, I would have to leave my home. And so I'm now looking at relationships between, like, as a community scholar, how can I connect to other scholars? And that's where, like, Sam and I are now having conversations about perhaps a field school and these kind of things, where that's where I can really see, how do we actually have allies in the institution? And just honoring my research project at UBC Okanagan, we have Dr. Sana Sharam and her graduate student, Dr. Alex Kent, and our student, I guess it's the PhD, she just graduated. So Dr. Alex Kent. And I talk about them as doing sort of the guerrilla nature, the guerrilla work, because we will be like, okay, we're having a gathering and we need cash to do the offering to the elder. And the university does not want to give out cash. And so there are ways, they are finding ways to figure out how to do this in the background, or things like, well, if we pay them, we're not supposed to give them a gift. And so they're finding ways to work the system. And I want to share that that's when I think of allyship, it's, we need people in those systems that understand them, rather than putting it on me to try and learn that colonial system while I'm trying to revitalize Indigenous knowledge at home, right? And so that's where I really, really see the connection between settler work and allyship, where it can really grow. Because if you understand those funding models and you can help us put our ideas into that work, that can be such a huge shift for the way we work. And I just wanted to lift my hands up to this research group that basically came to us and said, we want to help you get the dollars and we want you to lead the project. And so that's such a shift in the way we're doing research. So I just wanted to pass that on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. We just had one question in the chat from Prof. Busi Makoni that Smokii, you covered. So I don't know if Busi, you have a follow-up question related to that. If anybody else has a question, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. I have one to start if there's no questions currently. So I'm going to I just added a PDF to the chat. So I'm also a PhD candidate, and my dissertation research is related to food and language and home cooking practices. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the separation by gender of foodways activities, particularly related to Indigenous foodways practices. Maybe not your guys' area, but I'd love to hear any initial or preliminary thoughts from you guys. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about food. Food is so important. No, it's like, I just did a talk on what is culture with grade 11th grade students. And so we were talking a lot about food. But I will just share, as we're talking about gender and binary, that there is this, like, anthropologists sort of did this thing where it's like the men hunted and the women gathered. And I will tell you, I know more women hunters and I know more, my 76-year-old grandma, she passed when she was 76, and in her last fall, she got an elk, right? So that's like, this is, and she was like, at the time, we didn't know, but she had liver cancer going on, but there she is out in the bush. So just recognizing those pieces. But what I will say for us, and this is what I learned, and why I want to share this model is because we often hear these stories out there about gender binary, but in my culture, my chief said to me, we have no authority to tell you what your role is. So we can, historically, elders would look at children and they would nurture what they were seeing. So, like Sam's doing hockey studies. Well, he played hockey. There's these connections, right? And so we would nurture that in somebody, but it was never, when I teach that, sometimes say, isn't that pressure? Like, isn't that be a doctor or be a lawyer? Like, and I said, no, it's not like that. It's like, you would get maybe somebody would give you a rattle as a baby because they thought you'd be a singer. But if you aren't going to be a singer, you pass that rattle to somebody who needs it. And there's sort of these kind of conversations. And so for us, we had specifically food chiefs. And this is a part that, like, we're working on now to bring back, because we used to have salmon all the way up before the dams. We had salmon all the way up. They said you could walk across the river on the backs of the salmon. And now we are bringing the salmon. I'm gonna get emotional, but we're bringing the salmon home. This weekend, there's a ceremonial release of the fry of the salmon back up in the Upper Columbia. And we're trying to work on, what does it mean to have the habitat here? How do we change it so that they'll survive and bring them home? And so those connections, we have a leader that is responsible. And the reason that is that they help the people know when things are ready to harvest. And so we have, for example, we have a specific nikamsu. It's a specific root that we use. And that's this time of year now. So our chief of that food goes out and makes sure that it's ready to harvest, and then comes back and is like, okay, you can go, the season is open. And then also kind of monitors, if people are over harvesting or that kind of thing, there's somebody that is responsible and that you go to ask those knowledges. And on some years, they might say things like, oh, we really need to be careful. Like, there's been years where we don't pick as many huckleberries because we know the bears need them. And so it's not a good season. And so we be careful with that. And that means we have a leader that does that. And for us, there wasn't a gender on that. And so for us, what I've learned is that, like, if a woman wanted to go to war, you're supposed to let her go to war. And we have stories that they did that. But at the same time, if you were like not good at war, if you were putting people in danger, that's when you would get sat down. Like, or if you were, maybe if you weren't good in the kitchen and you were always cutting yourself or dropping things, that's when you would get set down. And so it didn't matter necessarily on gender, but it matters about, like, what you do and how, like, are you doing it in the right way, in the good way? And I just say that because I like, for example, with some of these roles, like, I'm not a great beater. I always drop them on the floor, and I'm not the sewing. It's not really the fine work is not my work. So just to share those pieces from our perspective, that I was really lucky to come home and sort of have people say, like, no, we don't think about it that way. Like, if it's what your role is, what you're supposed to do in the world, matters more than who you are or who you're sleeping with, is what they say. So thanks.
And I'll maybe just add a quick example from the territory where I reside, in terms of Haudenosaunee roles and responsibilities. And so I stress that this is my limited understanding as an outsider in relation to that. But Ellen Gabriel has said publicly that in Haudenosaunee culture, there are men's roles and there are women's roles, and there need not be more discussion of it than that. But if you think about the complexity of that cultural structure, so in a broad sense, Janice Hill talks about this in our interview in Masculinities, that the circle of the community is the purview of Haudenosaunee women, and that which happens outside of that circle is the purview in broad strokes of Haudenosaunee men. But part of the reason that that's the way things work is because of the clan system in Haudenosaunee cultures, where the women are the owners of the land in a sense, and for a man to marry into another clan, because you have to marry outside your clan, the man would move into the longhouse of his spouse because she was the tether, the anchor of the community in that sense. And so the women were traditionally responsible for the agriculture within the community, and that would also lead to many aspects of cooking, etc. But at the same time, in terms of worldview, Haudenosaunee culture is integrated with the ethic of non-interference. And if we're going to, share some academic resources, there's an article called Native Ethics and Rules of Behavior by Mohawk psychologist Claire Brandt. So Mohawk is a nation in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. But Claire Brandt's article, he discusses the ethic of non-interference, which is basically opening and curating the space for youth to come into their talents and their own passions, and not directing or coercing that. So in saying in broad strokes, these are what anticipated responsibilities are, and yet within those, there is so much autonomy for a person to find themselves in whatever role makes most sense. So it's a non-dictatorial expectation, even though the society is sort of organized in a fashion in which there are those separations and roles. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from the chat, or if anybody wants to share verbally, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah. Let me see. Tushabe, you happen to know quite a lot about similar areas. Do you have any comments to make?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I have some questions, but they are not clearly formulated, so I will just spit them as they.
Okay.
First, I want to thank you so much, and I'm glad I got here because the Zoom, didn't let me, but finally I was able to get on through the phone. So I am so happy that I joined you and listened to these great scholars and the wisdom, and I have been enriched. Thank you so much, Sam, and okay, now I have to find the names here. The two great speakers, Sam and Smokii. Yes, yeah, thank you. I had to look on the thing. Okay. So I have one question about allies, and in other areas I really am leery of that term, and I'm glad that you clarified it, that it's Smokii clarifies that it's not an identity. I think it's you who said that. But or maybe some or both of you. But I'm interested in knowing, how do you see allies, because like this work also includes processes of healing, in thinking about our relations with each other. What efforts have you witnessed, or what processes do you work with those allies to be on the same journey of healing, all the woundedness that we have inherited from our histories? And so the workings of it, I'm interested in knowing, because I have trouble finding, allies to work with in the areas, of indigenous knowledge, recovery and creation in relation to Africa. So yeah, if you could share your experience and strategies that happened there, and then I'll ask another question.
Thank you so much for this question. There's so much I feel like I could say, but one of the poems in my book talks about like how we're still at war. And so when I use that word, I challenge people, like, if you're going to say you're an ally, or if you're going to think of that as, you know, and I appreciate, you know, that it's a verb, but if you're going to think about it, I say, like, would you stand in front of one of our kids? Like, would you be that front line? Would you step in front of one of our kids and save their life in that moment? And what are you doing to protect our children? What are you doing to help us restore relationships? And so I think of it as that war term, and I always challenge people to think of it in that way. But in reality, yeah, I think settler colonialism is, you know, we're seeing it all over the world, just the extractive nature and the devastation. And I've started to look at it. There's a term called soul loss. There's all these different kinds of ideas, but I will share that my husband is a settler, and he has a very long history. So he's a white person who was born in Zimbabwe. And when we talk about it, he's seventh generation. And my sister said to him, well, what was your family doing there? And he said, colonizing, you know, and he's had to reckon with this past. And I will just say, on a spiritual level, that has been, that it took a lot of, for him, it took a lot of work, and continues to take a lot of work. And for us, when we marry in, just like Sam was talking about, I said to him, if we're going to get married, like, you are Tunaka, you're becoming part of us, and you have to learn that. And he works with our children. He's really magical with the kids. And so he is frontline with our kids. And I say, you have to learn our understanding so that you're teaching them the same thing. And I can't be flippant about this, that doing that, like, he was challenged in ways that to be able to step into that role, like, we had to go through some pretty big darkness to figure out what to do, and to close some doors on his history. And, you know, sometimes we see the memes of, like, breaking intergenerational curses, and I'm like, that, you know, these ways in which we're trying to make a new home here. But I tend to be somebody who challenges folks, because they always ask, like, people will come up and say to me, well, I don't think that I could have the connection to land that you have ever. And I say, well, I hope that's not true, because otherwise we're kind of screwed. Like, if you can only ever extract from the land, if that's the only relationship you're able to have, then how are we ever going to turn this ship around? And they kind of go, oh, you know, and I know Vine Deloria asks the question, you know, you're not Indigenous, but will your children be? And so we think about, what does it actually mean? And I know that's taboo. I'm not saying steal our culture. I'm saying, what can you learn from us? And I think in my experiences, I really have struggled to find folks as well that are willing to go as deep, and willing to connect in that way, because it does take a lot of unearthing. And I was calling 2020 the year of excavation, in a way, because we were looking at what happened with, you know, everything, but with the Black Lives Matter movement especially. And so when I think about this, and I think about how do we connect, my interest now is in looking at conversations between Black folks and in global Indigenous solidarity, really. And so I am working right now, and I met an Iraqi, Palestinian, Lebanese poet who lives in my territory. And there's also a Black woman, Shayna Jones, who has done her work is in theater, and she does Black and Rural. And so she actually put a call out for people who are the only Black person in 100 kilometers, which I think is about 50 miles. I'm not great at the translating, but in 100 kilometers. And she interviewed 40 people that she found that were living in Canada, that were the only Black person within that radius. And so she lives in my territory as well. And so now we are starting to get together to work on some artistic practice to say, what does it mean for these Indigenous people from around the world to come here? And I'm trying to model that for settler people, because we actually can see that when slavery was forced removal from your lands into North America, there are histories where you learned and cultivated our territories and created a relationship with our territories that to me feels indigenous. Shayna, thinks of herself as a tree talker. She talks about it talking to trees. And so I'm like, you are spending time with my territory and my land in a way that shows that this relationship can be cultivated and honored by somebody who is not the blood from here. And so if we can talk about that, when I lived in Anishinaabe territory, Leanne Bedesamosaki Simpson said to me, because I was actually born out there and then I was adopted back into my nation out here. She said, well, if you were born here, what is your responsibility to us? And so when we think about those questions, I'm really interested in how can we have solidarity together as Black people, as people from diasporas, to be able to model that for settler Canadians, or settler folks all over the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Right. Is there anybody who would like to comment on this? I know there's some people that have worked on issues about gender activism in different parts of the world. Dorothy, do you want to jump in? Dorothy is not there.
Hello.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, thank you for putting me on the spot.
Sorry, my apologies.
Thank you, Sam and Smokii. I'm enjoying the conversation, and my mind is just thrown to. So I teach Introduction to Gender Studies here at the University of Cape Coast, and oftentimes when to undergraduates, and it seems that what is readily available is the settler colonial ideologies about binaries and all of that, as you have spoken about. So I make it a point of activism to excavate some of the earlier writings, or historians that have gone back to excavate some of these writings and put it in a book about how gender relation was until the Europeans, or perhaps until the settler colonials arrived. And so there's this one book written by a historian of the University of Cape Coast called Agnes Edu, and there her book, her piece is titled Women in the History and Culture of Ghana, right? And so this is a deliberate attempt to go back to excavate how chieftaincy was, what women's role in the economic sector was, and even in politics, right? In health, in these roles about women being hunters, women being the ones to test whether to grow on the land or issues like that. And what she highlights in that book is about the fact that what we see now is as the binaries is basically the tragedy of the colonial experience that we've had, and before that, women were building their own houses. They were creating their own economic livelihoods, and then they were having even titles to properties, and the women were not forced to change their surnames when they get married and all of that. So these are little bits and pieces that sometimes is missing, or perhaps should I say it's deliberately covered to sort of give us an identity that wasn't what it was. And so when you were talking about having language for certain things that we, or should I say, for certain gender categories that wasn't there, it just struck me that this is exactly what Agnes was talking about, that the experience, and I think Oyironke Oyomi and other places, the invention of women in the Yoruba culture and all of that has spoken about. We have this tons of literature on the African continent that talks about the fact that we didn't know what was called gender, what was woman, and how it was different from other gender binaries or categories that have come up. And so this is my way of saying that this knowledge connects to many other parts. The human experience cannot be so different. we all connected somehow, some way. And our histories, if really we excavate them and put them in the right perspective, we will know that we're not different after all. So thank you very much for the talk. I'm grateful.
I really appreciate you sharing all of that, and it resonates so much with work that has gone on in North American Indigenous context. I'm thinking, for example, about Jeanette Armstrong's work on land knowledge and its relationship to language and to gender. And, she speaks in, so she's a Silks author, and, she speaks about there not being gender pronouns in the Silks language, and how, if she speaks to her elders, how ludicrous it sounds that if I'm saying that person, but I wanted to gender it, I would have to point at their genitals. And why would that have anything to do with what I'm talking about, right? And in that, the particular piece that I'm thinking about, she's talking about gender and the gift economy in Silks culture. And so the Silks culture is a gift economy, and it was initially a talk that she gave at a conference. And what I find really profound about that article and that talk is Armstrong she wants to talk about gift economy and how it relates to gender, but in order to do that, she talks about land, she talks about language, she talks about governance. And so she's building all of these elements of what is really worldview. And in order to recognize what she wants to say about gender, she needs that knowledge, that audience to be knowledgeable about all of these other aspects, because they're so integrated, right? They cannot be treated as discrete within that cultural perspective. And so for me, that really resonates with some of the things you were saying.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. It's the same thing for us. And I thought it was quite funny because I sort of asked one of my chiefs about, well, what did you learn about Two-Spirit people, or about, queer people in our culture? And he was like, well, I'm a little bit confused, to be honest. He's like, because there was a society. So we had like a cook society. We had the hunting society. We had different societies, chief societies, where they would get together and talk about leadership. And so he said there was a society of sort of medicine people. And he said, but they said that it wasn't all same-sex couples. Like there was some straight couples in there. And I was like, and this shows the colonialism, like, of my chief working through it in the lens of 2024 and the binary and everything he's been taught about gender. He's also like military, right? So he's been taught a lot of things about gender. And so he was sort of working through, like, I can't understand that it wasn't just people who were, in same-sex couples. And I sort of went, well, yeah, that makes sense to me, that it wasn't about who you love, or it wasn't about these things. And I also just want to honor, and I think it may have been Otonia, Julian Otok Patek, that I've heard do a talk and talked about, like, learning when I was like learning that I was a Black woman, right? Like learning that this is what this means, and I think that it's the same thing for me, of like learning like I knew who I was, and then I got told I was all kinds of other things because of what Indigenous women or Indigenous people were. And then there's a really beautiful word in Anishinaabe, which is in Leanne Betesamasaki Simpson's Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, which is biskabiing, and it means returning to ourselves. And so I think about this way of us unpacking these gender roles or these colonial understandings and returning to the heart of ourselves. And I also just want to recommend her book, As We Have Always Done, and I'll put it in the chat, Leanne's name, but As We Have Always Done has a beautiful chapter on Indigenous queer normativity, which I really love, because I have heard settler colonial people say, okay, well, there have always been queer people on these lands. And I like to challenge them, because I'm like, well, actually, my elders tell me that we weren't queer. We weren't separate. We weren't different. And so that even that English language of queerness. And so this idea of Indigenous queer normativity, like the language around that sounds like it's a dichotomy, like it sounds like it's two different things, but she's bringing that back in of the fact that we were actually, it was normative, it was part of our culture in this way. And I think that's the same thing of, you know, they want us to forget that there was any other way. And that's so that they can continue doing what they do. And one of the ways I like to teach the youth about this is, you know, they might tell you that culture can't change or things can't change, but we watched our culture change in 2020 faster than I've ever seen anything change. So I know that it can, and I continue to like seek those moments out of like just changing the way we consider these things. And I like to say, like, people need to learn our knowledges because they're not working for settlers either. This society is not working for settlers either. And so, you know, there is some in Anishinaabe, there's a prophecy called the Eighth Fire, where they say that, like, you know, as these things happen and as the systems fall, that we'll have to come together and be a new people. And sometimes that's interpreted as like white people coming to us, but I really think it's just it's the people stepping forward and choosing to honor the earth in a different way and choosing to honor each other in a different way. So thank you for sharing about Ghana as well, and about I think these conversations are happening everywhere. And I do think we're deeply connected, and that's why I'm looking to African scholarship and Black scholarship, and I mean Palestine and all of these different places that are actually changing. One of my elders said, we're trying to change the Canadian narrative, and so I think we're also trying to change the global narrative here. So, thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Prof. McKegney, do you have any concluding thoughts before we transition to the after party?
No, except to say I really agree with the idea that the tendency has been to think of queerness as a special category. I'd never been completely convinced, at least from an Afrocentric perspective, about that it always gave me the impression of white scholarship framing itself as the norm, right? And then secondly, I'm also not sure, there's something that we can talk about in the after party, whether the idea of creating a special field of Indigenous studies, whether the idea of a field itself is the way to go in reconceptualizing scholarship. Because the idea of a field has certain constraints, certain hierarchies, certain ways of behaving. But from the way what we were talking about now, we seem to be interested in undoing quite a number of different things. But if the aim is to create a field, it means you have created a conflict in what you're trying to do. There is a tension in what you're trying to do. Because on the one hand, you want to be consistent with the existing norms. On the other hand, you want to undermine them. But anyway, let's go to the after party for fun. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Oh,